Hello,
Hello,
Allison. Can you hear me?
Allison. Can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you.
I can. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just so here we are, and
So
just double check, make
here we
sure we're
are. Just
live.
double check, make sure we're live.
And okay, so Allison,
Okay.
thanks for joining us again, and thank you all for everyone who's online. And so, for those of you who are joining us, what we're doing here in the next couple weeks, I guess we have still, is in May of 2020, I drove out to Philadelphia, and I went to Allison's home, and we spent the whole afternoon. I shot an interview that ended up being over 5 hours, and I broke it up into five pieces. And recently I was kind of revisiting some of that interview, and I'm like, God, there's a lot of good stuff in here, and a lot of people haven't seen the latter part. So there's the first part has like almost 50,000 views, but then each later part, people don't want to sit around and watch a 5 hour interview. Um, but I was like, there's a lot of good stuff in here, so I thought it would be a neat opportunity to kind of revisit some of that and then follow it up with a Q&A with Allison. So we're doing that over the next couple of weeks here. We did one last Sunday. So every Sundays and Wednesdays until we get through the thing. So this is part two. We're going to show part two of it, which is about a little less than an hour long. And then Allison will come back on for a Q&A. But we do have one quick question that already popped up on the YouTube live stream. Oh, we have two of them. So we'll go ahead and knock these two questions out. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And will say this: last week, someone had made a comment that one of our volumes was higher than the others. I didn't hear that when I listened to it like on the live stream. So if anybody has any issues with the audio or video or whatever, let me know and I'll try to troubleshoot it. So Allison, question. In a few sentences, would you describe what you think our world will look like in 2050, also in 2030?
Uh, 2050 and 2030?
Oh, I'm
Is
sorry.
that
No, 2025 and 2030. My bad.
2025 and 2030? Well, I hate to try to predict exactly what's going to happen because I don't know. I think that I feel like it's identity systems are going to be set up for the vast and I think it's going to be sold as a convenience, and I think increasingly the education systems, the electronic healthcare systems, public benefit systems will all start to be uh, run through digital currency with incentivized elements to it. Now, in a under 10-year time horizon, it's hard to imagine that. I drive around, like I've gone, visiting place. I've had a chance to be out in different parts of the country, and some places pretty affluent communities with large homes and things, and I'm still having a hard time imagining. It looks so normal, like how these things are going to change up in terms of consolidation of uh, what people imagine to be private wealth. I would say most of the nice homes and everything out there are not actually outright owned by the people who have them. They're mortgaged, and they're in possession of the banks, and then ultimately we're like BlackRock. But will it look different in 10 years? Like, will they take people's livelihoods from them? Will they be pushed into cities? At what scale will that happen? How will people's retirement portfolios, will they actually attempt to erase, such as they are, people's pensions and people's retirement funds as they exist? I mean, I think once it gets to that point, we're talking more revolutionary types of actions. It's hard to imagine that people would just be sitting still for all of that to happen, for the whole central bank digital currency to roll out. So I guess part of what, and they're testing the waters too, and all of this is being fed into the simulation systems and factored in for the nudges and the tweaks and the behavioral modifications to get us closer to where they want us. I'm hard time imagining that in a 10-year time horizon, the world is going to be totally different. I think it will be much more controlled. I think that there will be efforts to make that level of control normal and possibly enjoyable through these digital simulation environments. I think I worry for the children because 10 years is a long time, right? You know, if you've got a 2 and 3-year-old and, you know, you're looking out 10 years and they're 12, and what kind of life have they grown up in? Is it under constant threat of some sort of, you know, anti-biological activity? What are the health protocols for children over the next decade? You know, clearly we're all being immersed in more paper from 2019, which I think, you know, the goal will be to be at that level of at least 6G, if not, you know, further beyond. And then that is very clear that their goal is to try to get people to sort of live most of their lives in sort of mixed reality holograms. So again, it's the story they tell, and then there's what actually happens. And so I'm not willing to concede that everything that they talk about is actually going to come into play. But I think the level of digital control systems is something that is going to be very ever present. I think the normalization of the synthetic biology will become more present, will become more normalized. And then the challenge will be like, how do we get onto our sort of mental faculties, spiritual faculties as this rolls out? Will we, how will we navigate all of that? So I don't know if that's the answer people were looking for. I don't have a clear picture. I'm not going to run out and say like dire, you know, that's not from. I think it's very concerning. I think that the systems of control, economic control, biological control, mental control, and then the question is, will we have the wherewithal internally in our own spirits to be anchored through that? Because 10 years is a long way to go. So.
Great. And the stream was chopping up a little bit there, but I did something that hopefully will have fixed it.
Thank you.
Well, it's you never with these things. It's hard to problem solve too, because the problem could be many different places. But so we have 3 other questions. So I'll just read these 3 questions, and then I'll have you answer.
No, I can only do like 2. I'll forget the third one. I'm terrible.
Oh yeah. We're at a 2 limit.
Like my memory is shot.
Okay. Has Alison seen Archbishop Viggiano? I don't know, Viggiano's recent public statement, and if so, what did she think of them? So I don't know what this is referring to, but
I haven't seen the statements.
Okay.
I mean, I have my position on the church in all of this. Right. But I mean, that's not to say individual actors may have their own.
Yeah. Well, we had Archbishop. I'm not a fan of the church, but I liked Archbishop Romero. So
that's true.
Can you comment on the African American vaccine hesitancy? I know that's not really your area that you focus on, but is that something you want to say anything about?
Well, you know, I don't know that the specific numbers and rates. You know, clearly. People have very legitimate reasons to be concerned about experimental medical procedures and on these, because historically there's been really reprehensible things done. You know, and I will say even to the Henrietta Lacks, you know, the idea of the synthetic biology and using people's you know, personal bodily materials for research gain without consent is really you know, something that is important to grapple with. I will say from the early stages of this, and it might come out in this interview, I can't remember, but it was very clear to me with my background of understanding impact investing that the narrative around health disparities in Black communities and Indigenous communities were going to be central to what came after the initial pandemic framing, whenever that gets to be over with, is going to be preventative health care. And so that they would end up weaponizing what were actually real concerns about um, Black communities, Indigenous communities living in conditions of environmental toxicity, um, economic stress, mental stress, community level violence, um, food deserts, many of these things that contributed, also intergenerational. So some of those stress carriers were across generations. Those would all end up being factored into these profiles for quote unquote preventative healthcare solutions. And under the guise of helping with what are actually real problems, those communities would be put under further digital surveillance as far as health biosurveillance in the name of addressing chronic illness. And, I have concerns because my framing is that I feel like this is more likely around frequency and nanotechnology, that looking at where some of the cellular placements were, especially in urban areas, a lot of them were being put on public housing, in low income communities initially in concentrations, that adding more radiation and more frequency to people is certainly not going to improve their health status, but that's what it was going to come out with. So I do find it ironic in that there are significant levels of concern in the Black community around injections, that this is happening in parallel with a major push for diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And I myself will say, I left my job of many years over, and it wasn't necessarily only their decision, but it was part of the city. Any nonprofit affiliated with the city of Philadelphia was requiring either injections or regular weekly testing and masking. And so I on principle, stepped out of that job that I'd had for 17 years over that issue. But at the same time, we were doing these very, very robust staff-wide trainings in diversity, equity, inclusion, justice work, with very intentional and I think well-meaning focus on diversity in hiring from our local community, which is predominantly low-income people of color. And so for me, I found it very ironic that what we would be saying is under this framing that we would advance if we were to have new staff positions open with a DEIJ lens, that we would also then be enforcing health protocols on a community that as a whole, in large part, we're questioning the health protocol. So to me, like, there's some cognitive dissonance there that I was never really able to get at with people. And it kind of points out sort of the liberal neo framing of a lot of this.
Okay. Yeah, and on the nanotech signals issue, I think that thinking and discussing about it is so foreign to most people. It's something, I mean, honestly, it's something I hadn't really even, I mean, I've done a little bit into, people that are concerned about the health impacts of all the cell towers and everything, and that's been around for a while. But like nanotech is so new to most people, they don't know anything at all about it. It's not really talked about much in the mainstream media or anywhere else. So like to try to spark up that conversation is difficult because it's so it's so foreign to people.
I mean, it is until you start to look into the research papers. And, really the push for this has gone back at least to the late 1980s, early 1990s. So it's not a new field. It's just something that isn't widely covered. And, there have been a lot of concerns, mostly some of it is around the narrative framing of precision medicine and cancer treatments and things like that. So when you find it, it's within this context of like, oh, it could only be helpful. But, I've mentioned I'm working my way through Alana's new book, which is, like a doorstopper. And, it's hard because it's really heavy information. But to understand nanoparticulates are invisible to the naked eye, even under a regular microscope. Like you need like scanning electron microscopes to see these materials, and they're being used as additives in all sorts of consumer products, products that we would consume, products that, sunblock. I had no idea that there's all these nanoparticulates. Now, they're not necessarily all part of necessarily nano machines, but that is the goal, is that they're imagining that we will end up with nets that they can begin to self-assemble in our bodies and manage our tissue function, and of course most of it is all put as something that's, only helpful, like we're managing, repairing tissue for people with joint damage or something, and you can't imagine that that would be a problem. But ultimately, when you start to see how they are treating other living systems, other cell-based biological systems like yeast and like fungi and different things, it's pretty wacky. I mean, it's pretty Frankenstein-y, the kinds of stuff that they're pursuing. So to imagine that they would just stop there and not consider using larger beings, especially, I guess, the Xenobot stuff that just came out, this week, about these living robot cells that now can like scoop around little powders and make other buds and other, reproduce in new ways, new novel ways. But don't worry, we won't let it get out of the lab. Like, I think I remember like these, whatever, Marvel has a movie about that. Yeah. So we have to start thinking about talking about nanotechnology. And I did tweet out yesterday, I think, a really good paper on the history, at least in the US, of like how this has come about. And it's very hard for the layperson, again, as with so many of these things, to figure out like what's smoke and mirrors and what's real, because we don't have electron microscopes and we don't have access to what these people are really doing. So all we can do is see from these papers and then presume, go from there.
Yeah. And if you're not familiar with like some of the stuff, there's a really great video. It was Alison did a three-part section on nanotech, three-part video live stream, three live streams, and I edited it down to, initially it was 10 hours worth of content. So I edited it down to a little over 5 hours. And so I'd send it to people like, oh, this is 5 hours. I was like, well, it used to be 10 hours, so relax. But it's, I called it Digital Empire, and it actually got banned from YouTube, but I do have it on Rumble and Odyssey, and I think that's it. Oh, Vimeo. I have it on Vimeo too. So I'll share the link here at the end of this for that, and I'll share that in the comments as well as soon as I pull it up. But that's a really great primer on nanotech. It's like I said, it's 5 hours. You can watch it in shifts or whatever. But yeah, the nanotech thing is hugely important. And we visited Rice University down in Houston last month, and some of the research they're doing is, I mean, they talk about it like they're just casual about it, and you're just like, this is terrifying. Like self-assembling nanoparticles, or I was like, no. But I mean, we think about the mentality of the system, and I've been involved with efforts to try to get fluoride. Like here in Denver, we've gone to like the Denver Water Board and presented all this information that fluoride is a neurotoxin, and any benefits for it are for your teeth are really topical. Like, it's not supposed to be ingested. So it's like the fact that like they still are putting fluoride in our water all over the country just blows my mind. I mean, it's a neurotoxin. Anyways, so yeah, these are the people in charge.
Imagine how smart we'd all be.
I know, like, yeah, I do wonder about that whole like, what's your
pineal gland,
your pineal gland
yeah.
or whatever. There's the claims about that. I don't know if it's true or not, but who knows? But definitely, I do know we shouldn't be ingesting fluoride. I mean, it's natural. There's natural fluoride in like water that you pull up off spring water or whatever. But that's not the kind of fluoride. This is an industrial waste product that they're actually using. Read up the history of it. It's kind of a trip. So let's do one more quick question. I've got a bunch of questions, but we'll get to the rest of you guys' questions at the end of this. We've got a 50-minute segment of interview we're going to show. And as we're watching the interview, think about questions during that as well, and feel free to put them in. So I'll do one more question, and then we'll start the interview segment, and then we'll come back in about 50 minutes, a little over 50 minutes, and we'll take more questions. This question is, can you comment? Oh, no, we already did though. How do you think the supply chain problems fit into the whole picture?
Interesting. Well, I mean, clearly they're going to work on managing consumption, managing your access to um, different consumer goods. I mean, that's because that is the supply chains are all connected with uh, the climate and the sustainable development goals. Um, I think ultimately it does go back to the technocracy concept of running the world on an energy based economy, this idea of energy inputs and energy outputs. So when they get us on the blockchain, like we're all part of the supply chain, like all of the metaverse is linked into the supply chain of some, we're all consuming and being consumed as data analytics. Um, I think they're intentionally breaking supply chains. And then the goal will be like in the ports and things will be to impose blockchain supply chain tracking systems. Again, that's going to be tied to the environmental social governance portfolios. So, they'll be
Real
tracking
quick, can I interrupt
companies.
you? Do you want to
Yeah,
just explain just really briefly what ESG is, just to give people a...
sure. Well, so ESG is environmental social governance. And within the larger social impact space, it's roughly aligned with the sustainable development goals, right? And so this idea is behind sort of the stakeholder capitalism concept, the circular economy, 21. Global capital has now realized they have seen the error of their ways and they're going to come up with a new and better kind of version of capitalism and global supply chains. And we're just going to manage them on dashboards for data analytics. So we're going to manage our environmental impact. And this is part of the carbon offset trading. We'll destroy a natural forest, but then we'll plant some sort of hybrid trees that are as a carbon sink. We'll be doing things that are essentially destroying nature, but then remaking it as a synthetic version of nature and saying that it counts as an impact commodity. So that's the environmental side. The social side is, general impacts on society and culture. But I do think increasingly it's also going to be managing culture, production of culture. And then governance, technically governance is not government like of a municipality or a nation state, but it's corporate governance. And this is things like, well, we have more people that fit in this category on our board, and that's sort of the governance model. And so all of those things are aspirational. They'll say this is the data analytics where we are now and this is where we hope to be, and then if we can improve our performance, these key performance indicators in these areas, like we're a much better company. And then I think increasingly within these portfolio allocations, they're going to start requiring people to have a certain amount of ESG stocks in the portfolios. So that's going to be a way of controlling the global economic system. But again, I don't think that it's controlling the global economic system to disadvantage people like BlackRock. BlackRock is actually like running the ESG alignment and metrics for the EU. So these ESG metrics are not actually meant to really level the playing field. They're meant to put in impose a lot of data analytics, a lot of supply chain tracking, impact tracking, sensor network tracking that will feed into the creation of the metaverse, because essentially everything becomes ubiquitous sensing so that they can capture and get credit for every supposed good thing that they do. But a lot of the enforced behavior change is going to be behavior change on behalf of individual people, as opposed to looking structurally at the whole system. Like, why do we have all of these giant global supply chains? Why do we have all of this decentralized just-in-time production? Why do we not have more local economies, regionally controlled economies, things that are legitimately sustainable? None of this is about starting to deconstruct and take power away from multinational corporations. It's all about like doubling down on all of this and making a new game, and the new game is impact investing. So anyway,
And
so it was about supply chain. So I think it's a broken on purpose scenario. They're going to use control of supply chains to manage populations. They're going to use control of food supply chains to keep people in line. they're going to use, most of the people, the entities that are involved in rolling out the fourth industrial revolution, like they've got a lot of resources, the Walmarts of the world, the Amazons of the world. They can weather a couple of like downturns in holiday shopping seasons way more than small local shops and things. So I think part of that is also tightening the noose on Main Street businesses and non-franchise businesses, and then further concentrating resources in the hands of these larger global entities that ultimately they'll probably say that, like, on a dashboard they look greener than regular people, like regular local businesses. And then within the supply chain, they need for us to be tracked with a digital identifier so that they consume, in terms of our environmental impact and our environmental footprint. And that goes way back. I did a video, I don't know, maybe early in the spring, about the recycle bank, which Philadelphia had one of the first recycle bank programs, which it's this behavioral nudge unit. And it's really innocuous thing. Like, we would get these nice, it was always coveted to get a nice recycle bin that wasn't the 5-gallon bucket, that was a little bit bigger. And, when those came out, they were so sought after. And then they gave us barcodes to put on the bin so that they would track the recycling by communities, and that they would give you scrip for being a good recycler. Only nobody in my neighborhood was recycling because we were getting scrip. We just recycled because it's what you do. Like, you put out the trash, you put out the recycling. Nobody ever used the scrip. But the scrip idea of the recycle bank points, which were only good for certain things that you could redeem them for, this was the very early stages of like good behavior credits. And that came out of Wharton. The guy who invented that came out of Wharton. So the city of Philadelphia was an early prototype in sort of behavioral, like non-cash leaderboard systems for green behavior.
Yeah, I was just talking to someone today about all the businesses that went under in the past year and a half, and how like those businesses aren't coming back, and a lot of that business has been swallowed up by the Walmarts and Amazons, and yeah, again, it's by design. That was the point. Okay, so let's we're going to show this segment. It's a little over 50 minutes long, and then we'll come back. If you have questions, just type them into the either on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll answer your questions when we return.
Sort of the Davos crowd.
What? Sorry about that. You mentioned the fourth industrial revolution. What is that?
So the fourth industrial revolution, it's a concept that's advanced by the World Economic Forum, and that's sort of the Davos crowd, transnational global capital. And it is this future that is imagined for the world that is largely based on, it's a digital world. It uses Internet of Things, sensors, so that we have the way in which we interact with the world is digitally mediated. Artificial intelligence, increasing use of synthetic biology and bioengineering. So literally, I talked about us being commodities as data, but literally being potentially re-engineered at the cellular level, which I believe is also linked in with these to the mRNA vaccines that are backed by Gates, which are also bioengineering, which has like real concerns about eugenics. And robots and automation. So, when we were talking about sort of key dates and things to think about, like when I say that this has been at least in place since the late 1940s, is this idea of the Massey conferences and cybernetics and Norbert Wiener and human computer blending. And Norbert Wiener was sort of the father of cybernetics and AI, who actually was a brilliant man in philosophy and mathematics, and was almost like a human computer. Like he calculated trajectories for missiles, in the Second World War, like in his head. but he was very thoughtful, and by the end of his life he realized what had happened. Like, he realized what they had created and the implications of widespread adoption of robotics would lead to enslavement of humanity. Like, humans cannot compete with robots on many of these tasks. And he started to speak out and was soundly criticized for it by these institutions that wish to advance it. But now we are very much getting towards not just robotics, but also platform labor, telepresence labor, avatars, and digital, there's humanoid robots, there's other kinds of robots. There are all of these manifestations of digital work that are taking place that are further marginalizing human beings doing the work. And that's what clearly we've seen with ed tech in schools. That's what we're seeing with telemedicine and healthcare, teletherapy and social workers. So the fourth industrial revolution is about this sort of seismic shift. And essentially, to me, it feels like it's about dispossession from the world and a wholesale clearing even further of the commons, to the point that people may no longer even have full control of their bodies and their mental states in this world that is planned by the fourth industrial revolution. And it's being planned by the telecommunications companies and the finance companies, these sectors. And so humans will be sort of redundant. Like, the billionaires, I think, would sort of like to imagine a world that's mostly them and like their class, and the robots and like a few people, batteries to keep the AI going, like to feed off their data. Like, it really is like the Matrix is sort of where things are headed. So there's like a new center for the fourth industrial revolution that's based out of the Presidio in the Bay Area. And I was watching a talk by Robert McChesney, it was from like 2016, where he said even then they had gotten into Davos and were listening to these talks. And like, everybody in Davos is like, oh yeah, it's like in a few years, like we could actually automate like all of our factories around the world, but the middle class would burn. So we're trying to figure out how to navigate that. Like, we could do it, but what would happen if we did it? And so what I'm seeing and have been seeing in the rollout, even in Philadelphia, which is a city of a lot of poverty already, is that like, we've seen increased high-tech policing, we've seen more and more surveillance systems, more and more social control systems. UBI is kind of, I believe, the thing that's going to try to keep the lid on the pot, keep it from boiling over, give people a little bit so that they don't totally rebel. But like, once we have the facial recognition, the gait recognition, potentially automated policing, weaponized drones, weaponized, they have those police robot dogs. They don't have weapons on them at this point, but they're using robotic policing and security, private security, to enhance human policing, so that like the robot will know where you are, so that the human person or the drone can come get you. Like, so there are many of these things that have been rolling out in preparation for knowing that this dispossession is happening. And right now, like, that's why it feels so frustrating to be disconnected from humanity, disconnected from our fellow human beings, because we can't properly even prepare for this. And it's just really disconcerting.
So you said you used the word dispossession. You want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I'm interested in some of these underlying concepts of like, you're being given something, but at the end of the day, we are being dispossessed of our agency, and our liberty. And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So one of the thinkers that has like really influenced me a lot recently, and I think really speaks to this time, is Silvia Federici. And her research was a lot about the clearing of the commons, and then later attacks of women around like land-based practice, and pushing people off of the land and pushing them into factories where they could be controlled. And then she actually brings her analysis up to the present day and World Bank and structural adjustment, and attacks on like indigenous women protecting lands throughout the world, and being, again, painted as witches in new ways. And so I think this linkage of taking things that we share collectively, pushing people into systems of how they live that wouldn't be their choice, to take away that autonomy, to set the terms under which you can live, like just feel really like they're all in motion right now. And I think one of the things that frustrates me a little bit in listening to some of the backstories of what's happening now with this, this shutdown, is the presumption that work is bad, like that having a career is something we don't, like we'd really just aspire to not work. I think it's more complicated than that, because over the past 10 to 20 years, the gig economy has turned what people do to earn money to live into more and more brutal situations. So I understand that many people are forced into doing work that is not satisfying to them, that's very oppressive. And we need to take that very seriously and address that element. But the other thing is that we should aspire to a world that we can be productive contributors in whatever way that we have our personal talents that helps self-actualize us. And some of that is around like caring for our communities and caring for our families and caring for each other. And that doesn't necessarily like manifest in just sitting on a couch. Like maybe that manifests in teaching or healing or building things or creating generative spaces or growing things. Like there should be ways of being in the world that we can participate in physically and with our brains and continue to grow, that may be linked into an economic value exchange system, like that are part of that. But to sort of say that we just don't need to work and we should all let the robots do all the work and then sit around, I think is a pretty naive understanding. Like, I mean, I think we all have a pretty good sense that people who maybe have careers that they've found satisfying have a real trauma when they retire. Like when that is taken away, when that part of your identity is taken away. So that's what I'm grappling with in this fourth industrial revolution is I don't really think that we want the robots as teachers. Like I don't really want a nano pill instead of a doctor. Like maybe there are people who love that. And at this point I sort of, because I realize this whole agenda is moving forward in a bipartisan manner, I will just frame my background as more communitarian anarchist at this point, because I think the whole system is broken. But we should care for each other, but we should have autonomy. We should have an option to do things that give us satisfaction within a larger understanding of our community context. And the robots really worry me. So if folks want to do the robot thing, maybe there's a part of the world that you can go do the robot thing, but you're doing the robot thing shouldn't preclude everyone else from having some other options. And that's where I'm feeling like that we're at now, is that we're on this trajectory that Google and Amazon Web Services and Palantir and these folks are sucking up our data and our humanity. And they're going to decide for us that we'd rather sit on our sofa and have a Kiwi robot deliver us a burrito to our door. And we don't have a choice in that. And that's not, I think that's a terrible future.
Humans like ice cream.
No.
Ice cream. That video was amazing.
It's terrible.
A couple things that came to mind when you were saying that. One was the Enclosure Laws. I don't know if you've looked too much into that, but I want to do more research on it. But just that idea of enclosure, it creates an image of and I knew it was about pulling people off the land and pulling them into the cities. And have you done much research on the Enclosure Laws?
Not deeply. I mean, a lot of it is around reading Silvia Federici's work and understanding that. I guess my forte is sort of wide. Maybe not super deep in any one thing. Well, but pulling on a lot of different.
Yeah, you need to have that. That's the problem what I have with academia is it's so compartmentalized, and that was one of the things I found interesting about Aldous Huxley was he was really about multidisciplinary, and he was attacked by the specialists. They said you can't be speaking on this. This is all we do is study this.
Yeah.
And he's saying, but you can get a perspective when you can connect what this
That's what I do.
He was a big promoter of the there's a documentary about him that kind of goes into his conflicts with other specialized, specialists.
But see, and that's like another sort of currency, right? Like I've got my credential, my reputation is more valuable than yours. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is this alternate worldview is not about domination, like I'm more expert, but is about a collective knowledge web. And that shared knowledge that can be applied is much more what we need in this moment than people who have certain very particular knowledges that are locked away and exchanged in very prescriptive ways. Like that's, to me, I have very little use for that at this point. I see our current situation on this sort of verge of techno-dystopia is part of a historic continuum that's based in racial capitalism. Like that's, it's based in what we've done to Indigenous people and Black people and through enslavement. And that we need to acknowledge that, and that we need to like find the people who come like in that acknowledgement from a point of like collective liberation. That if you understand this, if you're on board for collective liberation and you're not hurting other people, your goal isn't to hurt other people, like we can build the thing. And the identity politics piece of things that is really so intense in social media right now is that it's so polarizing and fragmenting that nothing can come together. And like the people that I've connected with, a lot of them are moms, and we're across a broad spectrum of political persuasions. And I have to say, like, my child identifies as non-binary, okay? Like that's and I love them, like they have my full support. I was asked to participate and share information with a group of like a women's movement that was connected with Latter-day Saints. And they said, you know, and I said, well, listen, if this is sort of where I'm coming from, if you support, you know, me as a mother in this, and I think I'm happy to share my information. And they were very affirmative, like, yes, that's great. Like we acknowledge that, we accept that. And so I feel like being willing to put your values out there, I don't feel like I should police other people's faith systems if you're coming at things that you're not hurting other people. Like and so that's where I'm at right now, is trying to, in all of these boxes, that infinite numbers of boxes of variations of boxes that people can be put into, is like, where are the people fighting, where are the people, I won't say fighting because I'm trying not to be militant, but like who would advance a liberation point of view of and not strictly just liberating people, but understanding like people as part of larger natural systems, and like to make this better world balance. And if we can bring those people together and tap into some of that sort of metaphysical power, like as a counterbalance to the cybernetic power, like I think that's where the hope is. Because to play by their rules, like to go up against US empire and global finance and technology and Palantir, like on their terms, that's not going to be a very good fight for us. So we have to find another way to advance a worldview that is counter to that. And we have to be willing, I think, to both be vulnerable and like be very clear about our values and put ourselves out there, that what our values are, and to see where it resonates. Because surprisingly, it resonates in some pretty unexpected places for me. And that's what I have come to learn over the past year, is that when you open yourself up and you say, these are my beliefs, who other people think that this is would be on the same track as this, the people who step forward are the people who you would think would be your allies have not been my allies, and the people who have stepped forward have come from unexpected quarters. But the thing is, a lot of people don't know the history. Like they don't know. We're not taught it. Like we're not meant to know it. I mean, I'm a white middle class woman with a master's degree. Like if I hadn't come into education in a public school system in a district that serves many low-income people, like there are people with whom I have made common cause and developed friendships with, whose paths I never would have crossed because society isn't set up that way to really have chances for meaningful engagement across class, across race, as peers and friends. And I'm really grateful for that. I mean, I fell down this rabbit hole. My life would be very different if it wasn't for the Philadelphia Public Schools, but, and so it goes. And so, you know, now I'm a, you know, Poor People's Army, right? Like, I think being open, so I joke around with some of the other moms, I'm like, we have like open bandwidth. But if you don't know the history, like you don't know what you don't know, I'm to this late. Like there are many people who are far more schooled in leftist politics or than I am. Like my background is art history and historic landscapes, right? Like it wasn't political economy and technology. But I had to learn it to understand what the world was happening in the world. So I don't know.
Well, if you're not an expert, you shouldn't be talking about any of this unless you've got the degree that specifies.
I've got no badges. I got no badges in any of this stuff.
Badges? We don't need those sticking badges.
I think there are many aspects to this situation that we're not meant to know. Like we're not meant to have all the facts, because not having all the facts leads to more speculation and more friction. For me, I had done all of this research about the fourth industrial revolution leading up to this, and I never would have figured that pandemic was going to be their trigger moment to make all of this rollout happen. It wasn't anything that was on my radar at all. But clearly, once I started reading like the World Bank stuff around pandemic bonds, it was pretty obvious that there are whole markets set up in advance of pandemic to take advantage of the situation. I mean, I think this crisis brings to the fore a lot of sort of larger issues of control, safety, privilege, thoughts about life. What is the meaning of life? How do we deal with death? Like there are many things that are packed into this that when we get in these online discussions, like the gray area falls away. I mean, I think we would all like to feel that we're in control of having a good life. And, you know, and that's something that like as white people, like we feel like we're, you know, like we're used to having that. Like many other people in the world are not used to having that. So I think in many respects that may be feeding into some of this dynamic. The stakes are super high on getting this industrial revolution thing in place, like around the world. And it's very clear that governments around the world have been very invested in biological weapons and synthetic biological weapons and printing viruses, synthetic biology viruses on computers. To me, to think that at some point governments wouldn't decide to use those technologies against domestic populations to accomplish the end that they want, you know, I feel like it's a possibility. I feel like there are no guarantees of safety. I think people would like to roll back and feel like if they did all of the right things, then we would be safe. And I think there are probably like the Black community, you know, Latino, like there are many people who just know it's not safe. Like there are no guarantees of safety in the United States. You know, that said, I'm not trying to be cavalier about all of these things, but really trying to look at the data. And I think what we're seeing rolling out with the fourth industrial revolution is data-driven. Everything is data-driven. Government is data-driven. Society is data-driven. It's all driven on data, but data can be used to different ends depending on what data you use, how you collect the data or don't collect the data, how data is compromised or not compromised. So I think it's highlighting all of these issues around data analytics and the power that data analytics have over society, both in very specific policy ways, but also just even on our mental states. Because two people can look at the same thing and interpret it very differently. So, I mean, that's where I'm at. We don't know. Like, there are many aspects of this that we don't know, but at the same time, what I would say is, under these conditions of extreme hardship that are advancing the fourth industrial revolution and further consolidating power in ways I think are going to have long-term negative consequences, we have to look out the other end and say, like, when are we going to say it's okay to come out? Because I think from a mental health standpoint and economic standpoint, there's tremendous trauma that's happening that can't be discounted. And from hearing them talk about it, it sounds like the plan is waves on waves of this, that this is the new normal, is facing pandemic. And whenever things get out of hand, that's the card that can be played, whether it's a pandemic in actuality, whether it's a natural situation, or whether it's something that is engineered by a political entity to a certain end. And that's just how it is. And it's kind of awful to have to think about it. But
well, I think a lot people have a hard time thinking of their leaders, or thinking of politicians or business people, or philanthropists as having any ulterior motive. They can imagine some foreign leader being this horrible person, but they can't imagine someone of their own color or their own nationality or whatever. I don't know. It's very bizarre to me, like that people can't grasp that there's something else going on.
Well, I mean, there's a huge mythology of America, right? For some people. I mean, just what we are, and what America represents. So, when you start to peel back, it's not all rosy. And, I mean, if you look at the money, for me, money and power, they're the same thing. You follow the money. And I think that and this is where the fourth industrial revolution in Davos is so key, is that I think, you always hear the two wings of the same bird kind of narrative, but truthfully, these programs are being advanced by powerful interests who have enough money to buy both sides. And they'll brand things and frame things differently, but they've bought both sides. Google has bought both sides. Jeff Bezos has bought both sides. And I think, I'm not a psychologist, but I do sense that there are ways in which people who are within that apparatus justify things to themselves and compartmentalize things. And I've found in terms of people who won't take meetings with me, they would prefer to have plausible deniability about what's actually happening. If no one comes and tells them, then they can say they didn't know when the time comes of what was really going on. And so that's why I feel like my little job is to run around with my half sheets of paper and say, I know what you're doing. It's bad, don't do this thing. I may not be able to stop it, but I can at least eliminate the plausible deniability piece, because I say, listen, I showed up to testify to tell you that this is what's happening, Poverty Committee. Goldman Sachs wants to turn the poor into data commodities with pay for success finance and digital identity systems. And the NAACP, the National NAACP, has issued a resolution saying that is a bad idea, to link digital identity, blockchain, to digitize public benefits. Not just me, it's the NAACP. So there you go. Let me add that to the record, so you all know, you're on notice, that when this comes, that someone said it was not okay. And at this point, it's very hard. I'm mostly a sole operator, with the exception of a couple dozen other moms, because we don't fit any mold. We can't go reform Party A or Party B. The Davos people are the ones, the Trilateral Commission, they're the ones who are pulling the strings, and you can't get to them. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't resist, but they're not touchable by an electoral process. Getting one or two more city council people who you think are going to be on your side doesn't really, that level of reform doesn't touch Davos. And what we're up against now is this brutal progression of biocapitalism that's coming on with drone robots yelling at you about social distancing and the robot police dogs in Massachusetts. Who is stopping that? Nobody's stopping that at this point. So it's going to have to be people organizing outside of existing parties, I think. It's not going to be an election. If you're sitting around, running around, knocking doors for an election, I got to tell you, if it was going to be fixed, it would already been fixed. So can I, just as a background around the human capital markets, so this idea of wealth being concentrated in a small number of people, and then you have lots of poor people. And it's almost like a plumbing problem. Capital has to circulate in order for the system to keep going, for growth. For people to continue to make money, capital has to flow. If it gets locked up, the whole system falls apart. And that's why, even after the last 2008 crash, everyone's still spend money, because if you stop spending money, the whole system falls apart. Okay? So to keep the money flowing, that's why we have to turn the poor into commodities. And the data structure for that, and this is to channel transnational global capital. So these are the 2,000 of the world's largest asset holders. BlackRock, Blackstone, UBS Bank, Deutsche Bank, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, all of these players, Vatican Bank, Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, all of this money is locked up and it needs a place to flow. And we are reaching a point in which the general population did not have liquidity or buying power to keep that going. So that's why this shift has to happen in terms of turning people into these gambling commodities. So then the rich are playing amongst themselves this gambling game over who gets the more money. That structure rolls through the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which may seem like to make not much sense. Like, how does the UN connect to impact investing? But connects very directly. 2/3 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are about poverty. There are a few that are about water and carbon and climate, but it's only like 4 or 5 of them. The rest are about public-private partnerships and about education and health and smart cities and justice and all of these things about managing populations, okay? So those were passed in 2015. The Global Impact Investment Network was set up like 2007, 2008, right around the crash. And that was getting everybody on board for metrics, impact metrics for social impact. Okay, they're connected. So that's 2008 or so. Judith Rodin and the Rockefeller Foundation. With the B Lab, they got everybody set up with the metrics now to play their game. Down 2015, everybody signed up for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, and we're thinking climate, but really it's a little bit of climate and a lot of poverty. So then there's something called the Impact Management Project, which is these 2,000 largest asset holders that are going to channel their capital into fixing the climate and solving poverty. Okay, because that's the apparatus, that is the plumbing to keep the capital moving when the poor can't buy anything. Okay, that's the new model, the new economic model. And this is largely backed by Open Society and Soros. It's called the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And he's bought thousands of economists all over the world at like $50,000 a pop. Open Society has to like set this new economic system up. So it's all tied to the UN SDGs. Number 3 is, I believe it's number 3 is health, and number 4 is education. Okay, they have said to make the impact markets work, it all has to be mediated digitally through ICT, individual communication technology. So that's phones and tablets. Okay. So all of the UN SDGs, ironically, are supposed to be channeled through digital devices. Why? Because they need the data for the impact investors, okay? Like if you teach a kid something, but it's not on a dashboard, does it count? Well, it's not gonna count for UBS Bank, so it all has to be on the dashboard. And so what we're seeing in terms of the shift to everything digital is to capture that data, to justify it for these. And it may not be fully online yet, but it's normalizing it, okay? So the way in which you have playlist education, it's not because that's better education, it's because it's better data collection for these impact markets. So I know much more about the education side because I was tracking ed tech for a long time. But healthcare is the other huge piece. So the nodes of sort of data collection on people are education and training, skill building, healthcare, and healthcare also includes mental health, and it also includes like addiction treatment in that. And then supportive housing. So that's like housing for people and services around their housing for people who are unhoused. Those are the 3 main areas of data collection. So what we've seen with this lockdown situation now is all of a sudden, at least 2 of these major industries that are connected, health and education, are all platformed. Everything is online. School is closed. No more school. Probably never any more school unless we wear like hats with pool noodles on the top or something. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so as I was studying this for the last 5 years, this model is called the learning ecosystem. And it's supposedly, I guess, when we go out, that you don't have bricks and mortar schools anymore. You just, it's like Pokemon Go education. You bump around and earn skill badges, like the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts, and it goes into your learning locker that later you can be, the AI can profile you for a job. But you learn through projects in work-based learning settings, and You go to the rock gym and earn a badge, and you go places in your community, but it's all under surveillance, and you do this instead of school. And then most of it's online. And for high school kids, you would just have a cheap Chromebook. And again, it's all consumption, not creation. You can't really make much on a Chromebook. You can just consume and be consumed. And then the little kids would be in these alternative settings like the YMCA and the Boys and Girls Club. And this has all been set up for at least the last 15 years, this infrastructure, as after-school programming and summer school programming. And I was always thinking, they call it learning ecosystem. It's out of Knowledge Works in Cincinnati. And I was like, how are they going to close all the schools? I was like, you know, I'm telling people, this is coming. And they're like, we can't see it. And I'm like, how are they going to close all the schools? Like, who would ever do that? Me and my husband, he's like, no one's going to close all the schools. Well, yep. Didn't see pandemic coming, right? And so now we've closed all the schools. And then the conditions under which in some places they're reopening schools are so horrific, it's like a prison. So people don't want to send their kid back to school. One, either because they don't feel safe because of health concerns, or two, they just think it's brutally awful. So there you go. Like, that's the education piece. Is pandemic leveraged essentially the learning ecosystem rollout once we're allowed out with our QR codes to check in at all the places. And this is tied in with blockchain vouchers, education vouchers, which will be these ESA savings accounts. I mean, the other thing that we've seen too is telemedicine, which is not, I'm not as deeply immersed in the medical side as the education side, but clearly the same situations were being set up in medicine with electronic health records and the Affordable Care Act and standardizing medical care, standardizing all the healthcare codes, normalizing telemedicine. Like, that has all been in the works for some time. IBM and Google working on AI analytics around medicine in other places with socialized medicine that they could get the big data sets. So that's already, like, now, you know, you can hardly see a doctor, right? You have to be screened through the telemedicine protocols. I mean, the other piece on this is supportive housing is that there are many people that, despite, you know, restrictions put on evicting people now and sort of postponements, there's a very clear sense that a lot of people are going to probably be dispossessed out of their current living situations, like in the next year. And while there's a lot of organizing going on around immediate, like, don't evict these people today, and that's what I was trying to convey, like, within the past year with, like, the tenants union and more socialist housing organizations, is that it's not just about the people. Like, we need to understand this pay for success infrastructure within supportive housing, because eventually that's the next frontier. It's not just keeping people in affordable housing situations. We have to take on this affordable pay for success housing, or essentially, and a lot of these housing, supportive housing programs are run through religious groups. So essentially, you know, the Vatican Bank is very deep into a lot of this. In Philadelphia, Project Home is the lead person with pay for success finance. And so then the question becomes, if all of a sudden large percentages of people have to access housing through pay for success deals that are connected ostensibly through faith-based entities, God forbid you get associated with one that isn't aligned with your belief system. Like, what does that mean? Like, in order to, like, not be on the street, like, and you probably won't be able to be on the street because the drones are after you, like, you have to comply with a belief system that may not even be yours. And then someone is getting kickbacks because this is the new human capital commodity scenario. There's huge ethical questions that we should be asking. And the other piece of this, there's a model. Santa Clara County, California is the incubator for a number of these early phase pilot programs. There's a pre-K one called Strong Start, I believe, an early literacy one. There's one for mental health, and there's one for housing. The housing social impact bond is called Welcome Home, the Welcome Home social impact bond. These deals, these pay for success deals, are overseen by a third party that assesses its success or not, according to the terms of the contract. The Welcome Home social impact bond, the third party assessing the data is Palantir. So Palantir is Peter Thiel's company that maintains contracts with ICE, Department of Homeland Security, and predictive policing contracts. Okay? So you're unhoused in Santa Clara. Maybe you have someone in your extended family who's undocumented, and now all of a sudden your access to housing, your data is run through Palantir because someone structured it as a global financial market. I mean, and in that, one of the investors in that deal was the reinvestment fund, which is based in Philadelphia. So you're essentially turning people's basic human needs into global investment markets and conditioning that on a level of surveillance that's tied into a very clear predatory police state apparatus. And very few people are talking about that yet, but that's going to be the aftermath of this COVID situation. What happens when your housing is predicated on a health status, right? And you leave for the day and somehow like somebody that you were in touch with 2 weeks ago changes your QR code and you can't get back in your housing. Like these are all things that are probably very technically possible now. They're not perhaps scalable or socially acceptable. And that's what I keep saying. There are these pilots that are in place that should they become normalized, should they become scalable, will have profound implications for humanity. And Silicon Valley are not our benevolent overlords. They're just not.
Yeah. Do you want to? Did you talk about digital ID? Did you want to talk a little bit about that, or is that something you kind of delved into?
Yeah. So the whole concept of human capital data commodities depends on, and also smart cities and Internet of Things, is that essentially there's one portal that aggregates all of the data on how you interact through technologies in real time. And these items are connected on, it's called a self-sovereign identity system or decentralized identity system. Often people are looking at blockchain as the mechanism, although I don't think it necessarily has to be on blockchain. And this premise that you accumulate assets, right? And these are assets that are maybe outside what I'm saying, like currency. Like a digital asset could be your birth certificate, your marriage certificate, the property you own, your certifications, your credentials, academic or otherwise, your health status, your voting records, your health records. All of this data accrues in one place. And what they will say, what the privacy people and the data commodity people, like, you have control over your data. Like, you can use it however, you can unlock whatever part of data that you want. But MIT has developed something called Enigma, which allows querying on encrypted data. So it may not be personal, PII, like personally identifiable information, but in aggregate, they can use and tap into that information for their impact deals. So digital identity systems have been prototyped through, again, global aid. There's something called ID 2020 that is connected to the United Nations, and I believe it's Microsoft and Accenture are the enablers, and the Rockefeller Foundation is part of it as well. And I know a lot of folks on the conservative side of things sort of point fingers and say, the globalists, watch the globalists. I'm like, we're the globalists mostly. Like the globalists are Microsoft and Accenture and Deloitte and KPMG. Like there are many globalists that are embedded within the United States. Not exclusively, but we have to understand that, like when we're looking at the United Nations. They're not a benevolent entity at this point. They've had longstanding ties to the Rockefeller family for years and years on the Trilateral Commission. So they're this apparatus. But ID 2020 is one of these systems that was used to track refugee populations. And they will pitch it by saying, like, oh, you need to run out of your house in the middle of the night and you don't have your papers. Don't worry. Once your retinal scan is on file, you'll just take it wherever you go. And like literally what they're setting up is, when I talk about like programmable money, they're doing their refugee benefits tied to retinal scans, biometrics in places in Scandinavia, like the Syrian refugee population. So they pay for their groceries with a retinal scan, right? Well, how convenient until you get labeled a dissident, right? Like, and then once they have that biometric data, there are whole issues about it being hacked or encrypted. Like if it becomes misused, you don't get that back. And that's like that's not just a password you can change. You can't change your biometrics. So these systems that have been refined through aid packages are now finding their way back into the United States. So Michael Bloomberg is a key player in smart cities and smart policing and impact investing through Bloomberg Philanthropies. He has underwritten, and he but he's donated significant monies to thousands of mayors of mid and sized cities around the country and the EU and India to get on board with data-driven government. And they backed a project in Austin where they were assigning blockchain identities to unhoused people. Again, ostensibly so that they could keep their medical records on a QR code. But that opens them up to become these impact commodities. And now there's a lot of blockchain work going on in Austin. That project evolved into something called MyPass, which is connected to the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation. It just so turns out that QDX Health, which is based outside of Austin, it's between Austin and San Antonio, like that company has developed blockchain health passports. So like I haven't made a direct link between the Austin homeless blockchain program and QDX Health, but very clearly once you have a digital identity program set up on blockchain, having a health component like would plugged right in, seems the next logical conclusion. So these systems are underway, and like I had mentioned, Amply, the pre-K identity app. The state of Illinois, not a surprise because Chicago is the futures market, right? Like what we're talking about is human capital futures exchange, really, is what we're talking about. That's why Pritzker, that's why University of Chicago, Chicago Boys. This is based in Chicago. The state of Illinois, they have a blockchain task force where they've looked at all of the options around blockchain. And there's a report that you can look up online, the Illinois Blockchain Task Force project, I think it was 2018, where they had a number of thought experiments about how they would use, and this is the programmable money, so no, that's useful to think about. So this hadn't been implemented, but what they did was they were theorizing in a diagram, SNAP, or food, money to buy food on blockchain and what that would look like. And that you would have an individual with a digital identity. You would have a digital wallet that would have a certain, amount of access put into that wallet. And then when you used that money for food, and it would probably only be programmed for food, your SNAP versus your housing or your healthcare, if you made the right choice, for the healthy choice, it would put money back into your wallet as like a subsidy. But if you made the wrong choice, it would just be full price. Okay, so they had like an apple and a hamburger. And so they would say, well, if you bought the apple, we'll like ding you back a quarter because we love that choice. That's a really good choice that you just made there. The problem, and there are a lot of people like, that sounds great because people should just be making the good choices. But there's no structural analysis, because what that is not seeing is that this person may live in a food desert where they can't get the apple. This person may work 2 jobs and some side gigs, side hustles, and they can't get to the grocery store with the produce when it's open. This person may live in a squat and not have access to cooking opportunities. Like, there are many reasons by which the right choice is not the possible choice. And then people say, well, it's just a plus. But the thing is, eventually then they will cut it back, and then the SNAP amount allocated into that system will only suffice through the month if you always make the right choice.
Or if they decide that, baby formula, or, you know what I mean? Like, there are health, corporate health versus, a community garden type thing. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
they could declare that, oh, this vitamin, enhanced processed food, we've declared this to be healthy.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Who gets to say what's the good choice and what's not the good choice?
Right.
And then, so if you look at this diagram, it's very simple. If your premise is there's the preferred choice and the unpreferred choice, you can apply that to anything, correct? You could apply that to a medical treatment. What's the evidence-based choice? That's going to be the preferred choice. And who's benefiting from that being the good choice? School curriculum. What's the preferred choice? What curriculum module? Do you have to pay a surcharge for the Black Panthers curriculum module, right? Literally, or somebody like who has a different ideology. If you have something outside the non-corporate state, you're going to pay for it, and maybe you're not going to be able to because we'll just put it out of your price range. What if it's a therapy, right? Well, we hear that this evidence-based virtual reality therapy, CBT therapy, is just the best. You want talk therapy? We don't really do that anymore. I'm sorry. So when we talk about programming money and controlling people, and then in the post-lockdown economic crash scenario, way more people are going to be put in positions of being controlled, ostensibly by the decentralized, wonderful blockchain liberation. But in reality, it is, in my sense, it feels very fascist.
Yeah. Another thing I think about with the own your own data, privacy, you have freedom, is I would get into arguments with people about sweatshops, and people would say, well, people don't have to work in sweatshops if they don't want to. These people choose to work in there. And I was like, well, they don't really have a choice. If you're poor and these are the only people that have money, that are willing to give you money for your work, you don't really have, you don't have a choice. A choice implies that you have other options.
Right.
And so I think that people are going to be in situations where they don't really have any other options than to sell their data or just to allow, what do you think about that?
Well, so I tried to make a little video myself to try to talk about blockchain benefits and smart contracts, and like to conceptualize how to make it visual for people. Towards the end of this, this was imagining a warehouse like full of individual lockers of data, like those kind of warehouses where you have extra storage or whatever. And outside of each door, there's a pad that has like real-time data flow about like the quality of the data that's in there. And then you've got social impact investors who can maybe they're just robots actually with a scanner thing, strolling the halls of the warehouse, like looking for a good buy on data. And so I sort of envision three kinds of people, data sets. You've got the rich people who never need to sell their data. Like maybe they have a digital identity, maybe all this data is being collected on them. They never have to sell their data. They don't care about their data. They can just actually pull a curtain down on their little number quality thing because nobody needs to look at their quality because they're not selling. They're not selling anything.
Or I'm sure the collection on them is going to be vastly less.
Well, they might have their own island. Like this is my concept is like Richard Branson out on Necker Island is probably not going to have so much Internet of Things stuff. His stuff isn't going to be all censored. The public subsidized housing, that's going to have lots of sensors on it, everything, right? And then maybe you have people who are like, make me a deal. Like maybe if I got a good investment on my data, I could go take that vacation. Maybe that's nice. Or maybe it's like somebody who's making by, but their kid broke their arm and they need some extra money to take care of a unexpected medical bill. And so then those people are just waiting to see what kind of deal can I get? But then you have poor people who are totally dispossessed who just have to leave their door open and just hope somebody finds something worthwhile because they're not going to be able to live without selling the data. And they just have to sell it at whatever price they can get it because that's just how it is. And I think, that's what we see in Philadelphia is that we have such a high poverty rate. We have so many people on the streets. We have so many people who are living through these economic cataclysms. They don't really have these choices to make. And adding data as a commodity isn't freeing anybody. It's just a new way to capitalize on people's misery, in my mind. I think what I'm looking for is a world of reciprocity and right relationships, and that isn't something that is transactional in this micropayment freaking blockchain world where everything is calculated, right? And everything is predicted. Yeah. I think that's an anti-life way of going about things, and that's my personal opinion.
All right, so we are back. Thank you guys. I've been following the threads here and everything. And yeah, I don't know if you guys noticed, I popped a little thing on the thing. I realized I made a mistake when I was talking about the academic who was pushing against the compartmentalization of academia. I also noticed I say academia, which is kind of funny. Anyway, It was actually Marshall McLuhan. I said Aldous Huxley, but that was my mistake. I wanted to correct that because that bugged me after the fact. I was like, I think I was talking about the wrong person. Anyways, Allison, can you? Oh shoot, we're not hearing you. Hold on. Did you do so? Oh, hold on.
Didn't do
Oh,
anything.
there we go. Okay, we got you. All right.
Hello.
Hey, we hear you now. Sorry about that. I had you muted. Um, Allison, so what are your initial thoughts after watching this after a year and a half, I guess now it's been.
Well, I was against blockchain for a while. I've staked out my concerns about blockchain identity position. Yeah, I'm glad to have that on the record. Um, I mean, I still feel very strongly that, I feel, it was interesting to hear me like talking about the schools and the doctors and stuff, and that it's, starting to shift back in the education space. And so, it's hard to know exactly how quickly the learning ecosystem model is going to come online, which is, I guess, why I hesitate to make predictions. I think things are marching not in a good direction and towards a destabilization of the educational system. And I think that the ramp up for vouchers and alternative payment systems is going to happen. And I just heard that, a dear friend who is, an activist in the space and a 20-year teacher in the San Francisco school district who had taken a strong position about their medical information not being put in online databases by the San Francisco school district was essentially sort of pressured through legal proceedings that they pursued very clearly to a point of no longer wanting to be in that school district and leaving and making other arrangements. So, and this is someone who is very talented and skilled teacher. And so I think that there is a lot of destabilizing social systems right now, and things are coming back, but not the same, with a lot more restrictions. And and I'm curious to see what happens this winter. My husband works for a local university, and I keep thinking like, well, when are they going to have some sort of flare up and send everybody home again? He's convinced that's not going to happen. I'm not so convinced, but we'll see going into the flu season, how the numbers are managed and what the policy rollouts are. I don't know. I'm curious what people think. I mean, I don't know if there's questions in there or thoughts. I
Yeah,
know sort of what I think. There's not
right.
like I haven't had an abrupt change of position. It's moving apace, maybe not exactly as quickly as I thought, but the trajectory is consistent with what I think I predicted.
Yeah. Um, well, I have a few questions. There was actually a little bit of a conversation that I would like to. It wasn't really a question, but there was a little bit of conversation about like naming this thing, communitarianism, communism,
Yeah.
capitalism, fascism, and I made
I
the
didn't
comment.
even really know communitarian was a thing.
Yeah, you use
when
that.
we were having this interview. Yeah,
Right.
I
Yeah.
know,
The
right?
the there's folks out there that are really hell bent on, just
God, this is the name.
this is
Yeah.
what it is, and this is all it is. It's communitarianism, and even if you say anything in support of community, which like my concept of community is different, but the folks that are really pushing the communitarian thing are very aggressive, and there is truth to what a lot of what they're saying is true. I mean, there is a there is some truth in what they're saying. It's just I think the challenge is like pigeonholing it into one thing because it's there's a lot of different things going on. And I think like the comment that I had made was I think it's more important to say what it is, like say rather than we don't necessarily need to name a name because people don't agree on what these terms mean. Like capitalism means different, communism, fascism. You don't even get agreement on that. So and it ended up dividing people. And I'm like, you know what? We can sidestep all of that and just say what it is. Like this is what they're doing.
Yeah.
You know what I
Right.
mean? So
That's what I
that's
do.
yeah,
Here's the map. It's this big. These are all the people. Like what,
right.
because really, I mean, in my frame is this stuff goes back at least probably to the Roman Empire. And, I know there are a lot of people who follow like mystery schools and things that like take it way farther back, further than that. And I don't have that expertise, so I can't really chime in much beyond. But like clearly the papacy, the Roman Empire, like whatever name we give it today wasn't the name that would go all the way back. And so I don't find that the labels are particularly helpful, because I think once you label things, then it tends to polarize the conversation. I prefer just to say, like, these are the players, these are things they're doing that I find morally abhorrent, and we should refuse this.
Yeah, I agree. So let's get into some of these questions. And if you do have a question, just so I can filter out the questions between just the comments that people are making, write the word question at the beginning. That way I know it's a question for Allison. So, okay. Has Allison uncovered any particular areas where these efforts at achieving a nano synbio fintech panopticon are particularly vulnerable to specific forms of resistance? So, like, what are your thoughts on challenging, or stopping this or resisting this? Or have you seen vulnerabilities or ways that this could be maybe?
Well, I'm still working my way through Alana's book. I will sort of defer. There are people who have done deeper dives into the nanotech space. Also, my friend Steffers at A Piece of Mindful has been doing a lot of research in that area. And, I know Sophia Smallstorm has done work as well. I mean, I think ultimately the concern is that an injection takes things to another level, and especially injections that are tied to a digital identity system. From a data analytics point of view and the nanotechnology point of view, is like a step beyond simply regular normal environmental exposure. And based on what Alana has said, is like there's some recommendations around, I think it's maintaining an alkaline body chemistry, and avoiding sugar, and eating clean, and don't go outside like an hour once it start raining for like an hour. Like there's some various things about like environmental contamination, and I know that there's individuals, and I don't have the person's name, but who's, I believe, Canadian, who's been working on different sorts of like buckets or something, like nanotech extraction, like that. I mean, and that's the challenge, is that we're all subject to environmental exposure, so it's not like a one-time thing. Like I myself was looking into, I guess there's some like baths, like borax and baking soda and Epsom salts and different things that are supposed to help with detoxing. So the active holistic health space isn't my main area. Like I'm sort of the impact finance blockchain person, but I'm trying to get up to speed and learning. So to a certain extent, I've at least bought some stuff and I've soaked a few times. I haven't gotten to the point of doing the nano extraction bucket. Yeah, so I don't know exactly how to go about it. I mean, I think something that Alana raises too in her books and her interviews, she talks about the fact that like we're all sort of, we have these synthetic elements in us at this point. And for her, she comes at things very much from a Steiner viewpoint, and that this is sort of a sacred spiritual engagement. And so part of that for her, like one of it is taking care of your physical body to the extent that you can, limiting exposure, detoxing, various detoxing protocols that some people are more familiar with than I am, but I'm sure you can look them up online. But then the other is sort of a spiritual practice, because some of this is a parasitic entity. Like it's these parasitic harmonic consciousnesses that are these like machines, right? And so you have to fortify not only your physical body as best you can, but your spiritual practice and your faith positioning in all of this, because it is, I think it is a parasitic force in that way. So I guess that's pretty much what I have to say about the nano at this point. Maybe, I mean, Alana's book is like this thick and I've got about this much so far. So maybe by next week I'll have more information.
Gotcha. Well, I think the idea that came up in this interview, which is the hats with the pool noodles, might be a good
Oh,
idea. I personally just use bubble wrap and duct tape, but you know, everyone's got their own methodology. Um, okay. Um, did you guys meet Jeff Krippall at Rice? Also, did you know the Grand Rapids, Michigan, where the Devos dynasty rules, was the first city in the country to fluoridate the water supply? We did not meet him, and I did not know that. Allison?
yeah, no, no, we didn't actually get in any of the buildings at Rice. We did. Um, I think we have those last two to go, Jason. Those are the last couple.
I'm
Jason's like, we
almost
did a lot
through.
of stuff in Texas, and I'm like, we did.
I'm almost through editing them. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
so like the last couple of spots on our way out of town were at the Houston Medical Campus, where Rice has a sort of a collaborative biotech lab, and then on the campus specifically. But we didn't have any direct contacts. I mean, mostly I went because James Tour, who's a key figure in working in the laser produced graphene space, is there, and a lot of nanofabrication. And then I believe it is James Smalley, who got the Nobel Prize for, I don't know, identifying these buckyballs, which are these fullerenes, this sort of carbon 60 buckyball carbon nanotube structures back in the day. And so it sort of, Rice at that point became a center for nanotechnology research, which is why we wanted to highlight it. And it's interesting because it's a relatively small, I mean, it's well-regarded school, but it's not a major research institution that is running so many DARPA military contracts. And then it has this collaborative space with the university system is very interesting. I didn't know about Grand Rapids. It's interesting now I think about it. I mean, I actually have all of these projects in the back of my mind that I want to get back to working on, but Steffers and I were looking at the issues of water and programmable water and graphene. And, I know DeVos actually was involved in, I think, a boxed water program that might have been connected to Flint at some point. So I do think that there is some element in terms of engineering the composition of water to advance sort of the larger resonant frequency, maybe gene expression, like within tissues. And so it would be interesting either both from on the fluoride side or other additions. There's a lot of money going into the infrastructure bill too around water infrastructure. And I think increasingly there's going to be impact bonds tied to environmental bonds with water contamination, water structure that will include nanotech in them. So I think that Michigan is a central player. I know that the World Economic Forum is setting up shop in Detroit. And then part of this giant map that I made in Dallas, it extended to include, there was a company outside of Dallas in Richardson called Zyvex Labs, which has played for several decades a key role in nanomolecular fabrication, atomically precise fabrication. It's called Zyvex Labs. And they had gotten together for this nanotech program in 2007. But Rick Snyder, maybe I mentioned that the last time, but like that he was part of that gathering in 2007. So I think Michigan has a role to play, but I haven't. Maybe Detroit will be another giant map. I don't know. I feel like I know somebody on Twitter who's connected with Chattanooga. And so it seems like Chattanooga actually is a hotbed for a lot of this stuff and connected to Oak Ridge National Labs and Department of Energy. So I might have to do Chattanooga in between, but maybe Detroit and Michigan should be on the list because there's a lot going on.
So yeah, here's a picture of James Tour. And this guy's kind of an interesting guy. He's like a very religious guy, but he's there at Rice University, and he's got a company called Universal Matter. And actually, Allison, the video that's premiering tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, if you check her channel, this will be live. So this is one of the site visits to Advanced Materials. and yeah, downright creepy research that they're up to out there. So
I mean, I would recommend James Tour has quite a few talks online. He's very out there about his faith practice informing his scientific research. And it is actually interesting if you listen to the story that he tells. He actually grew up Jewish, and in high school worked at a gas station somewhere in New York City, where on Fridays they would throw out all the magazines of the gas station. So he would go and get like the Playboys and Hustler magazines. He had a porn addiction. Like, that's how he talks about it. And then he went to college, and as a freshman became a born again Christian, and like cleansed him of his addictive behaviors. And then he would, had been getting up at 5 a.m. to read Bible verses ever since, for the rest of his life, and became a very successful nanotechnologist. And so evidently his frame is that all of this stuff in terms of like turning the world into edible computing systems is God's plan. So
yeah,
yeah,
add religion
it's
to
an
the
interesting
mix. It's kind
personality.
of terrifying. It. Who is the other guy, the Mormon guy that was like talking about the rules for gods on earth or whatever? What was his name?
Oh yeah, Lincoln Cannon. Yeah,
Lincoln Can. Yeah,
Lincoln Cannon,
yeah.
transhumanist.
Some of these people's belief systems are pretty creepy. Um, okay. Do you see cash disappearing fully? The shadow economy is the lifeblood of the economy. It will be so wild. I've thought a lot about that too. Is like they need to have some space, and I think they'll do it through crypto. But even the system itself still does a lot of like dark, money laundering, they'll want to make sure that a space is left open for that. And I imagine it'll just be done with crypto. But like it's pretty clear to me that is the goal, to get rid of cash completely. But do you have any thoughts on that, or comments on that, Allison?
Again, it's kind of like trying to figure out what's going to happen to all of these like expansive homes in affluent neighborhoods under this program. Like, it's hard to imagine the physical reality of it just disappearing, unless essentially they foreclose on all the homes and push people into storage containers in this, in the downtown, and just let them go back to nature. Like, there's some things I just can't quite picture, how it's going to happen in terms of the material reality of it. I mean, I know between talking to Deepti and being in touch with Raul about Latin America, like the informal economy is huge. I mean, the cash economy, the non on the books economy, especially in other countries, is the majority. And so, how does one just take that away? But again, DP has talked about different kinds of payment systems and digital payment systems that are making their way even into relatively small villages. So and I think it's like I've talked about with with what Stephen Newcomb says, is like the people on the shore watching the ships like couldn't imagine what was on that ship, like the mindset of the people on the ships, until later they realized what a huge problem, but they didn't even have a word or a concept for how bad it was,
Hmm.
like that what was arriving. And I sort of feel the same way with these the blockchain systems and the digital currency and the sensor networks. Is by the time people get up to speed on what's about to hit them, like, it will be in place. And it's very hard to communicate a concept to people who have no point of reference. They
Right.
just have no point of reference for it. And I would say even what's still the case is that the whole your freedom tokens or whatever idea is that, like, I think that the tokens for the masses aren't even going to be anything that resembles actual money anymore. It's going to be, you earn points for rights and privileges. It's going to be like little tickets, little chits, behavior tokens that allow you to do a few things outside the norm, and then everything else is pretty depressed. But again, it's very hard to picture the time frame on this. I mean, I know many people in the US are already like have a very precarious existence, and I don't have a good sense about how many people actually have things in retirement savings or whatever. Like, that's sort of my question. Like, do they just clean it all out, um I don't know. It's the finance, that part of it isn't my expertise. That's probably something John Titus or some of those folks would have a better understanding of.
Hmm.
I can't imagine like all of a sudden people's 401ks being converted into crypto or these stable coins. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Okay, well, I want to do a little. I want to ask you guys. According to Facebook, we have two people watching on Facebook, and if that's the case, next week I might just do a streams directly to YouTube and skip Facebook, because it does take extra bandwidth. I also think these numbers that they give us are not accurate, both YouTube and Facebook. I don't think they're honest about the actual numbers. So who knows what their actual is. So if you are watching on Facebook, just make a little quick comment, just say hi, just so I can see, because this is a little test. I want to just actually just it's a little experiment of mine.
Oh, really? Only, I don't know. Maybe since I left Facebook, we're all,
You were
my social credit currency on Facebook has dropped. I don't
That's
know.
right. That's right. Allison. Oh my God. Block that one. I heard that Florida let their membership with the National School Board Association expire. How do we interpret events like this in the framing of the Great Reset and the rise of mega regions? Thoughts on that?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess I have a hard time knowing exactly what the National School Board Association does.
Wrong one.
So, I mean, I know that there are a lot of these different membership organizations. As I said before, I think in some respects, like the Florida, Texas counterpoint, like dialectic is something that's meant to sort of look like the radical, difference to California and New York. But it's a different flavor, a different way of getting people on blockchain. I was just revisiting, and if people want to check out my YouTube yesterday, I put a couple of video clips from a 2016 panel on education savings accounts. And that panel was at the Foundation for Excellence in Education fee, which is Jeb Bush's organization, Excel in Ed. And they're very much about pushing digital wallets for education and school choice. And I think I just noticed today someone shared that Michael Bloomberg is putting $75 million or something into charter schools. He's also bankrolling some school choice movements in California. And I had some people trolling me on Twitter that were from the California school choice. Essentially, what I said was, you're not telling people the whole story about choice, because choice, when it shows up, is going to very likely end up, if not in the immediate first round, at least in later rounds, as a digital voucher tied to digital identity, which will mean that all of your community-based resources, if they're approved to be reimbursed through the wallet, are going to be collecting data and transmitting data back for these impact markets. And within that panel, that 2016 panel, the model was actually in Las Vegas. And there was a debit card program in Arizona. But the folks from Nevada were saying, essentially, this was a program that was going to be situated in the Treasury, and that the people who were advancing it understood educational vouchers as banking products, that they were finance products, they were banking products, they were not education programs. And so I think that speaks to this tokenization of assets and futures betting across the board. And I will say that Florida has been central for years in online learning, in digital education. INACOL, the International Association of K-12 Online Learning, came out of Florida. One of the first big virtual school systems was based in Florida as well. That's what's going to be coming, and I would not be surprised if it also contains some virtual reality apprenticeships or education modules, because that's very big in the virtual reality and simulation industry in the Orlando area. And you've also got Magic Leap VR there. So, I think that they need to advance non-traditional options for education, so that they can start to investigate and get the systems in place for wearable technology, telepresence, educational models. And I think both Florida and Texas are very well positioned for that.
Right. Um, okay. What cell phone, computer, and other technology brands, if any, do you feel are safe using?
I mean, I, other people like take harder positions on that. Like I don't think any of it's particularly safe. And I think people who would like to advance certain brands over other brands, like I'm not about markets or choices or telling people or spokespeople for any of that. And I kind of do question, um, just do your own research and decide for yourself. I don't have necessarily, I don't have any confidence that any of them are better than others. Like once you know, if you look at Surveillance Valley and look into Signal and Tor and all the stuff, like they lift these things up so that you embrace these products. And it's all like, I'm not a coder. I'm not like a cybersecurity intelligence person. I don't know these things. And I actually don't really feel super confident that any of the people who assert that they're the white hat version of this, that you can truly trust that. So
Yeah.
it's the
I
Wild West. I guess people just decide for themselves.
Yeah, there are some things you can do to try to minimize it, but at the end of the day, I think like the NSA, like they're gonna get anything they want, or like the people behind the scenes. But there's a guy named Rob Braxman who I actually follow on YouTube a lot. That he talks a lot about the phones and de-googling your phones, and there's things you can do to try to like minimize it. But like I'm pretty skeptical of anything that's claiming to be secure. Like I think that they have backdoors, and like I said, this was all built, like this is all DARPA military technology. So
The internet, that's
right.
it is built that way.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean the tin cans and the strings tend to work really well. That's the challenge though, because it's like we're even this we're on Facebook and
I
YouTube
know.
here, and they're like throttling us. They're not preventing us. They're not allowing us to even utilize this space, and it's just going to get worse as their algorithms get better and their technology gets better. And and I think what they want to do is they want to have the appearance that you're actually talking to people. I saw something happen recently on Facebook where it's actually like it's put up some walls, and I don't know how it decided like, oh, you can tag this person and not this person, but like my tagging ability has been massively throttled recently on Facebook. So they're going to continue to play these games, but they want the appearance. They want us to have the appearance of this is somehow democratic and fair, and like they're letting us actually communicate while we're not actually communicating with anybody. I mean, if you think about it, according to YouTube, we got 34 people watching. I used to do events and I could get more than 34 people in the room. So, at some point, I think the technology is just going to be like, hey, we need, the technology isn't really doing shit for us. So, um, it's a tough one. uh, let's see. Living in a rural area versus a city. Will living in a rural area be safer than living in a city? I actually think I personally don't want to live in a city. I would much rather live in a rural area. But eventually, they're coming for the rural area too. But the cities are where it'll be concentrated. That's the smart city. Thoughts on that, Allison?
Well, I mean, I've said this before, but I think it's going to come after everywhere because what we're dealing with is a weaponized atmosphere, and the nanotechnology is in the atmosphere, and the frequency weapons are in the atmosphere, and um, even the different 5G and stuff, a lot of it is satellite based. So, they'll have it in the remote areas. I would just say, because I think that this is a spiritual engagement, like stand up for what you love. Jason, if what you love is being in a rural area, then that's good. Like if that's where you feel like you want to be, that's good. But I actually really loved being in the city. I mean, I think that that's been part of what's been so crushing for me the past year and a half is that I appreciated the vibrancy and the intellectual stimulation and the camaraderie and the opportunities and the culture um, of being in Philadelphia. Like I loved my city, actually. Like I loved that I was part of like we were like the underdog city, and we were kind of like the, we, you know, there was a lot of stuff that I loved that got taken away, and it was if not just the geofencing things, but like the heart of it got pulled out by this psychological warfare. And then I felt abandoned in a place that looked like the place I loved, but it wasn't. And, I still haven't totally given up on that. And for me, I would prefer to take a position of advocating for the vitality of cities as not smart cities, even though it's an uphill battle. Because realistically, I'm in my 50s. Like, I'm not someone who's going to go live in the woods, like, realistically. Like, I'm not, I just don't see that happening, especially because the rest of my family wouldn't be doing that either. So, unless things get really, really bad, like, I would prefer not to abandon and still advocate for the community that I felt I had, that could somehow be restored. But my choice isn't everybody's choice. So I would say make the choice that feels right to you, but don't do it from a place of feeling like you're escaping it.
Right.
Like, understand that it is a broad and cohesive takeover, and then find the place that gives you strength and that gives you purpose in your life, and then engage with this from that location, wherever that makes sense for you.
Yeah.
And clearly, it's probably going to be more challenging in the areas that have concentrated populations and, militarization and other things. But that doesn't mean that from a principled standpoint, like, to me, I feel like spiritually just leaving out of fear, and that primarily that place is allowing it to the agenda to move forward.
Yeah, I agree, and I would say that if you're looking to escape this, forget about that, because indigenous communities had sustainable off-grid systems and that got swallowed up by this thing, and it's the same thing. We're dealing with the same thing. And so for me, it's just like in the city, I'm just worried that they're going to get to the point where they're going to be like, oh, lockdown, you can't leave or whatever. And I'm like, the one thing that gives me peace of mind is actually going out into the woods. And so like, I'd like to have that mobility and freedom while I, fight this thing in my way of, trying to educate myself and others. But the idea that you're going to run away from this. Derek Brose was in town and he gave a presentation a few months ago, and he was like, it was kind of funny because he's like, we can't be pessimistic about, we need to be positive. And then he's like, but we can't fight this. We're not going to be able to stop this. And we just need to, go out and find some land or whatever and live off, live away from it and build our own blockchain systems or whatever. And I just totally disagree with that. I don't think that that's taking into account what we're actually dealing with here. And I think it's just a situation where we either stop this thing or we're done. You're not going to find an island that you're going to just run away from this thing on. I wish that were the case. I mean, I don't even wish that were the case, because then it means all these other people and these other life forms are destroyed. I mean, this is a battle much bigger than just us saving ourselves, Anyway,
Yeah.
that's my thought. Do you think
And I would say, I
Yeah,
think
go
in
ahead.
this in between moment too, the push for telepresence labor is that there's probably going to start to be a shift into some rural areas. Like I know somebody in the Dakotas, and when I started looking into nanotechnology, there was a ton of nanotechnology in South Dakota. And that's kind of surprising to me. But when you start looking at cheaper, like, essentially what they're doing is they're setting up almost like gig pop-up labs for like biohacking and different things, and like telepresence work, where maybe you can, have access to more sophisticated lab equipment remotely. And so I think that there's going to be, that's what's been birthed out of this lockdown situation, is that you've got a lot of people who are just transplants. They just pick up their job and they do it from wherever. So I think in the in between time, where they haven't fully gotten the mega regions together, that there is going to be some dispersal of people into, rural, mountainous, like rural communities, or Midwestern rural communities, or places where the cost of living is lower, and then they have telepresence. I know Julianne has spoken about Tulsa, that they had incentives for people to relocate to Tulsa and work from Tulsa. So there's going to be like the second tier mid-level cities in maybe less choice geographical regions that are going to start to offer relocation packages, and then the widespread adoption of the telepresence model economy and even teleeducation and everything is going to, I think, and who knows how long it's going to last before they get people locked into a more mega region format. But I think they're going to start moving people around at will. That's part of the game, and that the telepresence economy will be part of that, and part of maybe even the infrastructure. Like maybe they will designate sort of mid-sized ruralish cities as like telepresence hubs, and then start to build up the smart infrastructure in those cities as well. So I think that there's a range of phases. When, at the beginning, people were saying like, what is the look for 2030 to 2050? I don't think it's going to be a hard lockdown immediately, but they're going to be gradually reshaping what the work environment looks like, and what the aspirational geographies look like. And, some of that has to do with, the telepresence and the opportunity zones and the infrastructure, and where BlackRock wants to put its money, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think 2023 is a significant date for digital ID? Was the next question.
I'm not particularly clear on that as a specific date. I don't know if there's a particular report or something that people are looking towards, or
Yeah,
an
I'm not sure.
esoteric number system.
That was just
Yeah.
a question. There wasn't any more detail.
I mean, for me, like the people who are already on digital ID, it's an important, India was the first use case, right, with Aadhaar in the digital ID. So like, by whose standard, right? Like if you're already part of the digital, like when I came into the space, my frame was around, displaced refugee populations and retinal scanning. And so, unless you're talking about it being linked to like central bank digital currency or something, which is possible, I'm not familiar with like a hard and fast date on the digital ID part.
Okay. Any guess on why so many CEOs are retiring at once? And we had this once before too. At the beginning of it, there was a wave of retirements, and now we just had another wave. So it is interesting when you see a whole bunch of CEOs retire, and or commit suicides, which happens too. But anyways,
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
No, I'm always kind of No, I don't have any thoughts about.
No thoughts about that. That's all right. You're
retirement.
supposed to have thoughts on
Some
everything.
people like know what the plan is. I mean, I don't know. Like maybe
Yeah.
they've got enough to buy their island or something at this point.
Okay. So, do you know about graphene hydroxide? A German chemist, Dr. Andreas Nowak, talked about it and said it was in the injection. So that the idea that there's graphene in the injections, and that it's different from graphene oxide. And apparently he died shortly after making this statement. So, do you know anything about that? I mean, I know you covered that a little bit, and there's some others. There's another group of scientists. I actually saw them on the High Wire that are claiming to have found graphene, but I didn't know if it was graphene hydroxide or graphene oxide. But do you have anything to say?
I
about
haven't
that
had
at the
a chance to watch that the video. I mean, I have to say there's part of me that whenever, like, I tend to shy away from the hysterical things. I mean, no offense, but like when it's like razor blade, blah blah blah, like guy die, like to
And the
me
apple,
that well, I mean, I realize that what we're navigating is psychological warfare, and I think that people in the resistance space have to understand that they're being subject to it as well. You know what I mean? So in terms of energetics and stuff like that. So when I see these really inflammatory takes on things, it makes me question, right? Then so I mean, clearly graphene in various forms has been used as an adjuvant. My position continues to be, I think the goal is not mass death, but biocompatibility. And I haven't really seen a significant enough change to change my position on that. You know, I think biocompatibility with a side of harm, either like related to cardiac function or neurological function that can then be market creation for these various neuroprosthetics and wearable technologies, is probably much more in line with what is desirable for them in terms of a market shaping and getting the neural prosthetics and getting the nanotechnology systems into us. So if the premise is that there's some frequency technology that's going to cause mass death, I would hope that's not the case. Like, again, I have any insider knowledge? I don't. I feel like a lot of what's happening is about ginning up panic in communities. And I guess my question is to what end is that? So I would just, consume your media with the awareness that their goal is to hijack your consciousness, and it's happening on both sides. So weigh the information, consider what you want to do about it, and and let's see. I mean, it's possible that we could be wrong on that assessment, and that the harm could be much greater. But at this point, I don't think that I fully believe that with regard to injections and boosters and everything, people have made their choices, and their minds are committed. There are very few people along the road who are changing. Like maybe after the 6th booster, they'll change. But like at this point, adding this more inflammatory information, I don't think is going to wholesale change a lot of people's attitudes. So then to what end? I would say be mindful of it, and then be cautious and see.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
And
kind
know
of
that nanotechnology is and this synthetic biology is definitely a major part of the agenda.
yeah, I'm kind of curious, if there's going to be any cognitive dissonance in people once you realize that this isn't going away. Like this is a permanent thing, and there's always going to be new jabs, and there's always going to be new variants, and this is a way of life now. Like this is intended to be a regular thing. This is not. There's no going back, and so I'm kind of curious if at some point people will start to question it's you know what I mean? Like it's like you realize that you're going to be getting a jab, several jabs a year, probably, or at least 1 or 2 a year for the rest of your life. That's what I think, and I think that's what their plan is. But who knows? What does Alison think of the collapse scenario or long emergency of global industrial civilization as described by James Howard Kunstler? Now, James Howard Kunstler, I actually have his book, Long Emergency, back there, but he talked a lot about the collapse really based on like oil depletion and things like that. Are you familiar with Kunstler at all?
I know the name. I haven't read the book.
Okay.
I mean, I guess my position on the oil is that, I feel like that there are alternative energy sources that may be out there that are not necessarily ready to be brought center stage for economic reasons and other reasons yet. Like, I think that there's a lot of science that proceeds that is not open to the public. And so I'm actually, while my frame is that there is tremendous environmental harm that's being done um, within the globalized economic systems, and consumption, material consumption, and sort of unbridled economic growth. I don't necessarily buy into the collapse. I'm not a Malthusian. I don't necessarily think that there's going to be some peak oil and then that's the end, boof. Like, because I think that they're actually already developing these sort of, not that I necessarily approve of the nanotechnologies, but they're almost imagining like we're going to have like, new buildings built out of living materials that synthesize energy, and like they have these ideas, like, and these are things they're talking about out loud, like who knows what the things are that they have behind the scenes, but that for whatever reason, I mean, we know that the Teslas and the Keeleys and there's this there are these alternate options, and that we're not really meant to know about, like the Jason's work. So
Do you want to clarify that they're not talking about me?
no. Well, just the Jason scientists. It's sort of an elite group of scientists that are now managed under MITRE Corporation. But there's like the off the book science, and then there's the on the book, and that's part of, I would highly encourage, if people haven't read Alana's fictional series Sub Rosa America, it was actually really helpful and for me in understanding some of the history of the deep state and secret societies and things. But the Jasons are part of that, but they're actually real. You can look them up. So yeah, I mean, I think that clearly the emergency scenario, the Malthusian scenario, plays into the cybernetic sustainable development goal agenda 21 engineering of the world, like through one global cybernetic machines harmonic system.
Yeah. It's also interesting that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, it's also interesting the role that the oil companies are playing in this new fourth industrial revolution. I mean, and they're not just like, they're not just sitting aside like, oh, I guess we're out, but they're actually actively playing a part in this, right?
Oh, very much. And, I would say when I was doing my education work, I would run into things like, the oil companies were major players in this, like beyond the technology companies. Like I kept running into Exxon and thinking like, and it didn't quite make sense that it was just about training kids to be, geoengineers or something like that. Training kids' minds to think about oil a certain way. I think they were definitely in the energy futures markets. And the more you look at, and this is what I'm trying to tease out right now, is that it seems that this idea of a forced transformation of life into a holographic, like metaverse reality, and that's the kind of thing that is being advanced by this Japan Moonshot project. Like our Department of Energy and our National Science Foundation are hand in hand with them on that, as well as the EU Horizon 2020 project. And for me, it's very interesting that it's the energy departments that are behind that. So I tweeted a couple days ago, I said, it feels like that there's a new Manhattan project going that's around this like cyborg metaverse model that's happening through the Department of Energy, which is sort of the legacy of the Manhattan Project, only it's out in the open. I mean, I'm sure there's some secret parts to it, and like nobody cares. Like if you sit down and you actually look at what all of the Department of Energy programs are working on, and that they're literally saying that they're going to advance a future of life as a cyborg, and then nobody like nobody's even talking about it. It's crazy for me to think about. So again, a lot of it is connected to Texas, and I think it's not just the extraction of the resource, but it's the speculation on the energy markets. And so if and that's what Enron was about, and then Milken had his own kind of speculation. So it's these energy trading financial products, where the energy companies, it's not just about the oil wells. It's actually new sets of infrastructure that are about extraction of data and speculation of data on data.
Right. So we'll just do a few more here, and then we'll come back on Sunday. This one's actually just a comment, but I thought I would put it up there. Don't forget about the Dallas and Citizens Council, um, and Ghislaine Maxwell's older sister at UT Dallas. So someone wanted to make that point.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I've got Christine in there, and I'm finally getting back into writing my blog. I just started today, and I kind of hit a wall after the summer, and I just, part of it is, you know, guys, when you listen to this, these talks that we did in May of 2020, right? And they're all still pretty fresh and relevant,
yeah,
but it's not getting out. Like the word didn't, I mean, not despite your efforts, Jason, like there were many people, despite 40,000 people hearing it, that nobody picked up this ball and ran with it. Like none of the big names, really, none of the people who had the big platforms picked up on this material. And and I'm not even saying they needed to do it with credit to us because it was about us. It's just the information. And I don't know if it's because it's a non-traditional frame, the worldview that's presented is non-traditional, and therefore it wasn't palatable. It didn't fit into the ticking the traditional boxes. But um, I'm to the point of trying to start writing again, but I didn't want to just rehash everything I already said
right.
because it didn't work the first time. So
Yeah,
now I'm like, okay, well, what do I do? And so now essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to break out that giant map and make blogs connected to the Greek mythology. And, and part of that, the Melina family and Christine Maxwell are part of that scenario. So that's,
yeah. Well, I was so naive when I did that interview. I was just like, because I started to piece, with your help, piece a lot of the stuff together. Um, and I was like, oh, so that was in May. And I seriously thought, oh, by December, I really thought that, I mean, not in the mainstream or anything, but I thought within like the circles of people who were challenging the narrative around COVID and were resisting some of the lockdown stuff, I thought that they would get on board with like, oh, but do you want to know why all this is happening? Do you want to know what the point of this, what the purpose is, the goal is? And it hadn't happened. It still hasn't happened to the extent that it should. And like, it's kind of frustrating because it's like there's certain pieces of it that certain people won't really incorporate into it, namely the social impact. I don't know why that there's like there's a fear around challenging like markets and challenging blockchain. Like those are the two big things where people are like stuck on, like they don't want to talk about the role, because that is the um what do they call it? My brain just farted. Anyway, so I was pretty naive coming into this. I was like, oh yeah, by December we'll actually have a conversation happening around this. And here we are, like, with 35 people watching on YouTube, and that's not to work. There are other people that are adding, really important pieces to it, but there is a new system that's being put into place that not very many people are really grasping yet, unfortunately. But hopefully, that will change.
well,
Um,
I mean, I will say though, in the past 18 months, the number of big name platforms in this space who have become affiliated in some way with a blockchain system are very high. I mean, people with the larger platforms, whether that is blockchain media affiliations, whether that is crypto investment, whether that is some sort of blockchain social media platform, phones. I mean, you really almost can't throw a rock and not hit somebody in who has a major platform in the resistance movement that doesn't have ties to some sort of blockchain technology.
right.
And it's a problem because
And
then it
remember,
becomes,
it's interoperable. These things are being designed so eventually that they'll be interoperable. So, I mean, that's an
well, they'll be
important.
interoperable, but they'll also be conditional. Like we know that the central bank digital currency transactions, the main places that people will have to spend their money is not going to accept the kind of crypto that people have. Like it's a total fake out. It's all a total fake out. And, and then once you add in using the interoperable data to feed the machine learning and feeding these speculative markets and data analytics on the secret network, um, it's horrific. But yeah, I mean, I don't see things turning around because I continue to be targeted for raising these questions.
Right.
And, people just got to own their own shit. You make your choices. And I truly feel that once people have some sort of engagement within the crypto space, it's just an energetic connection that takes them over and that they just can't think critically about it anymore.
Right. Um, so have you already talked about the voice of God technology, or have you ever gone into that where they can make you think you're hearing voices? A recent TED Talk actually confirmed that this technology exists. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I mean, the early computing, I mean, it's always been about like Joe Licklider at MIT. His background was in psychoacoustics. So the acoustic element is really important. I think, I'm based here in Philadelphia, and we are one of the centers for cochlear implants. And so I think there's an element, going back and research around acoustic implants. So yeah, I mean, I've talked to people who have been targeted. I know of the technology. I mean, I also know that I have on my YouTube channel, and I'm trying to remember what the date of the experiment, but it's maybe 5 years ago that they were actually using frequency to do uh, what do you say? Like sending thought signals from one brain to another person, like, and they have it on video that they were doing. I've like the word has escaped me, but like projection of your thoughts into another person's consciousness without a device, actually. um so yeah, the stuff, I mean, brain is the new battlescape. I mean, that's what James Giordano has said. And there's a gentleman who has done he just finished his PhD thesis in 2019 on synthetic programmable hallucinations. So literally they are trying to get these nanoparticles beyond the blood-brain barrier so that they can affect consciousness, that they can monitor consciousness, and that they can affect it. And it's very unsettling, because I think maybe it's in a later part of the interview, but I was talking about marinage, as being the model, like escaping to the swamps. And then what does mental marinage look like in this space? So
The next one here is back to this. The next one here is actually just a comment, but I thought it was worth mentioning that Saudi Wealth Fund has donated $50 billion to Uber over the past few years. And they said data is the new oil. And there's something that you said once that I thought was really relevant, is that Uber is not a transportation company. It's a geo fencing company. Do you want to just say
yeah.
something about that?
Well, I think mobility is a key aspect of social control systems. And I think that the push will be for less private physical, like cars, and the push towards rideshare, and that will happen under the ESG markets. But I think increasingly these private companies are interested in actually taking over public transit systems. And that's something that's been happening. I mean, even several years ago, they were looking at taking over like rural school district busing systems. And so the ride sharing was happening in a privatized way. And so if you imagine your mobility in your transit system being linked to a privatized transit system that might include, buses or trolleys or subways, where to access the transit you have to have a QR code, and the QR code has various behavioral conditions attached to it. And then they're actually, I think, looking at creating transit as an impact metric, right? So you could use improvement of your public transit network tied to economic mobility, or to health benefits, or to some other quality of life benefit that you can attach a price to, and then you can connect it to a social impact market, and then you can track all of it through the QR codes, and then you can start to manage use of the system cybernetically, tracking all of the QR codes and the usage codes. Because sometimes they're even setting it up as free, like they want free transit, but what you're paying on, I think it's going to be set up as impact markets and data. And then those systems will be connected also to last mile mobility solutions, which will be the Internet of Things enabled bikes and scooters. And so if you can imagine, like if the goal were to get machine learning and to digitally simulate having a digital twin society, digitally twin cities, you've got sensors on all of these things. Like you've got your device because you need it to get the QR code on the bus, and so it can track you to the bus stop. It can track you when you get on the bus. It can track you when you get off the bus and get on the scooter, and vice versa, and all of the rides. And then all of that data gets input into the AI to sort of mirror the system. But then ultimately, both either for financial market reasons or strategic military reasons or social control reasons, they can start to tweak the models. And I think more and more we're seeing the digital twinning stuff come out in the open. And so they can start to decide when things are activated and deactivated in terms of your QR codes and how many people can use the bus and how many scooters you're going to have. And it's all going to be engineered through these AI systems that are beyond any sort of accountable government. And that's part of the huge aspect of the Michael Bloomberg What Works government, is that, we're going to have government efficiency and transparency on blockchain with open data, and we're going to run our government on data. But essentially that means that Oracle or Cisco or IBM are really your government. And like you might have a media personality stand in front and say that they're your mayor or your city council person, but they don't have any say because the algorithms are running the whole system. And I was just looking at a blog post that someone shared with me about sort of how corrupt the crypto exchanges are, and that they're sort of like offshore, deregulated, like the Wild West of all sorts of like really dark trading systems. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, that's pretty intense, this game, the crypto trading game of these, coins. But what happens once it's not just fiat currency, but these coins represent human capital portfolios and pay for success deals on people's lives. And then the markets become automated, and then they're connected to the smart sensors and your mobility and access. It's concerning. And so again, once we think about these markets and concentrations of wealth and power, it's not just the UBS banks or the Lloyds of London or, the SoftBank or pension funds. I mean, the sovereign wealth funds are a big part of it. And the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund is actually their innovation fund was through SoftBank. And so they're working on the smart city development. And in that, in a very real sense, you can see the pivot in the nature of the big oil money moving into the new realm of empire, which is the data empire. Yeah.
And we'll do one more question. And let's see. Oh, have you read any of Ted Kaczynski's work, the Unabomber? Because he was very anti-technology.
I know.
I actually read his manifesto like years ago, but I don't really remember it that well. I just remember he was warning about technology. His solution wasn't really great.
I should read it. I think I skimmed it a bit ago. Somebody shared it, but I didn't get through the whole thing. I mean, I will say I remember reading Jonathan Moreno's book called Mind Wars. He's a bioethicist at Penn, and I was really interested to find out that he was actually, Kaczynski was subject to psychological experimentation while he was at Harvard. And I don't know that it was necessarily consensual psychological experimentation. So I can see now, like if you had the whole scope of what was going to be unfolding, like literally I try to imagine what it sounds like for me today to talk about the things that I talk about in terms of like neural weapons and, neural prosthetics and nanoparticles and blood-brain barriers. And I sound like, I'm very, very fringe. I can't imagine what it must have been like if someone, 20, 30 years ago had this knowledge and like no one to really explain it to. And that even when you tried to say it out loud, it sounded unbelievable.
You're walking around the street, you know, like talking to yourself, and they're like, "Oh, this guy's nuts," and when actually everything he's saying is actually true.
Right, I know.
Yeah, I mean, even now, it's just like for most of the people that I know, like I try to talk about this stuff, and I'm like, I know this sounds crazy, uh, but it's real. They're actually doing it, and I can show you. They're, show you how it's going down. But yeah, well, thank you, Allison. We'll do this again on Sunday at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and we'll show one more segment, and we'll take more of your questions. So think of your questions. Also, one of the things that both Allison and I are trying to do is figuring out new ways to explain this. Or so if there's certain things that you're not getting, where you're like, you've heard it, but it's not clicking with you. Maybe bring that up, and maybe ask a question in such a way that might help us to refine the explaining it or something.
Yeah. I mean, and I would say too, like, I mean, if people care enough to like spend a couple hours with us thinking about that, like questions that actually reflect some of what I'm trying to bring to the table about the impact markets and about the digital identity systems. I mean, there were a few questions about that, but in some ways it seems like a lot of the questions are outside material, like bringing in and sort of saying like, what do you think about this other thing? And so I guess what I'm hoping is that if what I say makes sense to you, is that we figure out better ways of articulating that in so that people can take this information to their communities, because like literally we did this 18 months ago and it's not getting out. And so if you're here because you actually value the information that's being shared and it does make sense to you, then like we should be centering questions on like, I need some clarification on these points, or like, how do you think this fits in with telemedicine, or how do you think it fits in with housing and homeless services or wearable technologies? Like, I mean, the Uber one is connected to that in some respects, and like the school board questions, but we need some of the nuts and bolts so that people can start to say like, oh, Allison, like some of the things that you said here 18 months ago, I'm seeing in my community in this way. Like, what should I look for in opportunity zones, or what should I look for in smart materials, or like what should I look for in my university system in terms of what departments? And because none of this stuff is hidden. Like I just spent several weeks looking into UT Dallas and all of the different programs that UT Dallas has going on in applied AI. And like literally today I just added an individual, and his whole research area, they were working on digital twinning, the digital twinning AI, health AI. And it was like, it lays it out. Like his focus areas were artificial emotions, artificial consciousness, neurobiology, DNA computing, social robotics. Like they tell you. So like we need to be able to incorporate that piece of it, I think. So I don't know if that makes sense, but like I was kind of hoping that people would say like, oh, Allison, like now I'm seeing that this makes sense in what I'm seeing in my communities, and that hasn't quite gelled in that way yet. But I don't know if it's because people don't, it still isn't clicking for them, or other narratives are hitting them more. Like this is like, because we're in information warfare, so I'm trying to figure out like, how do we deconstruct. I mean, and I'm not saying you have to necessarily buy into my narrative, but I'm assuming like if you're here, it's because you either want to know more or that it resonates. Like, how do we get through? Because literally there's a battle for consciousness and people's attention right now. Right. And the stuff that I'm talking about is not getting it. It's not getting out there.
Yeah. And I need to do, like, I know Lynn Strawn Davenport is a collaborator and friend of ours, does a lot of that too. She's looking at locally. She's like, oh, Allison, check this out. Like, this is what's happening here. And here's this person. And
that's
like,
why Dallas is like this.
Yeah, big. It's massive. But I was like, I need to start doing that here with Colorado, because there's a lot of stuff going on here in Colorado that like I need to be paying attention to. But everyone can do that wherever they're at. They can find out like, oh, what's happening in my own neck of the woods that relates to this. Would be interesting. So yeah, and then also too, like if you haven't, like I know people on here are probably already doing this, but check out Allison's YouTube channel, Alison McDowell. This is the one that's going to be premiering tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. and but that's dealing with
These
universal
are
matter.
short form.
Yeah, they're
This is
short.
only like, this is me like under 5 minutes. That's like
They're
a treat.
usually more than 5 minutes, but they're between 5 and 15 minutes typically. So, but yeah, check those out because they're really great. There's a lot of great information in there, and like you can do them in short little spurts. But yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and please come back on Sunday, and we'll do this again.